All right, let's talk about who is hurt and who's helped by unanticipated inflation. So, unexpected inflation is going to hurt some people. It's not going to affect some people, and it's going to actually help some people. Um, I want to be clear that when we go through this part, we're talking about unexpected inflation. Anticipated inflation, when people see inflation coming, they plan for it. They put their money in places that are hopefully going to give them a higher rate of return than inflation rate, and basically they plan for it. Unanticipated inflation, when we're not expecting it, that's going to redistribute real income. It's going to hurt some people and it's going to help some people. So let's talk about who's hurt. First off, people living on fixed incomes. Uh, People who receive the same income each month, who don't receive increases that are tied to inflation. If your income is fixed and there's inflation, that can definitely hurt you. The clearest example is a retired couple living on a pension, right? Say they retired in 1991, a third of their purchasing power would have been eroded by 2009 because of inflation. This isn't just people like earning incomes when we think of incomes like wages, but also landlords who get fixed lease payments. Um, they're receiving the same amount each month, but when there's that unanticipated inflation, they can buy less than they used to be able to. Lenders or creditors who lend money at fixed interest rates are going to be hurt. This is the example. Bank lends Bob $1,000 to repay in 2 years. Let's say it's a zero interest loan. And if price level doubles in that 2 years, Bob's going to still pay back $1,000, but that $1,000 will only be able to buy half of what it could before. So the bank or the lender's worse off. People with fixed interest savings accounts, unanticipated inflation does hurt savers. Um, as prices rise, the real value or purchasing power of our savings deteriorates. Um, Groups that are helped or unaffected, these are people on the flip side where unanticipated inflation actually helps them. First one is people living on flexible incomes. People that have flexible incomes, um, where their income is tied to the rate of inflation, can actually be helped. Easiest example of this is people on Social Security. Social Security is tied to the Consumer Price Index. And so when there is an increase in prices, people's Social Security payments go up as well. There's also workers out there that have what's called a cost of living adjustment. This is an automatic increase in wages that's tied to the inflation rate. Um, and they can be helped when there's unanticipated inflation. Um, so their wages go up at the same time as inflation. Then debtors. If creditors are hurt by inflation, then debtors, the flip side of that arrangement, have to be helped. Unanticipated inflation helps them because they're now paying back money that is worth less. They're paying back money that can buy less stuff than it could when they borrowed it. So let's talk about methods used to compensate for anticipated inflation, including COLAs and inflation premiums. So when we have anticipated inflation, people can we can adjust nominal incomes to reflect those anticipated price changes. And one of the easiest ways is that cost of living adjustment. This is the acknowledgement that if your employer agrees that 3% is a good raise this year, but there's going to be some inflation happening, um, say there's going to be 4% inflation. Well, if you take a 3% raise, you're going to be able to buy less, even with that raise. So some workers, especially in the 70s, um, insisted on cost of living adjustment, or COLAs, to make sure that if 3% was a good raise and there's 4% inflation, then really my pay should be going up 7%. Um, there's also some savings bonds that have these sort of adjustments. Say you want to buy a savings bond, but you want a 5% rate of return. Well, Series 1 bond pays that rate of return plus the inflation rate. So let's say inflation rate was 2.2%, it would pay 7.2% that year. Why are savings bonds good? They're safe. You can buy them directly from the government. They usually pay a higher rate of return than bank accounts, and you can cash them in anytime after a year. They're exempt from state and local taxes. Disadvantages: they can't be bought or sold to or from other people. Um, if you cash it in before it's 5 years old, you forfeit the last 3 months of interest. And sometimes it pays lower interest rates than other bonds. The second way that we can adjust is inflation premiums. This is the side of the banks. Um, this is how they figure out, okay, if we agree that you're going to take out this loan and 5% is a good rate of return for us, um, but we know there's going to be 6% inflation over the course of your loan, well, then I, as a bank, I want my 5% interest rate plus 6% to deal with that inflation. So I'm going to charge you 11% on that loan. And that's what's called an inflation premium. So if you look at it, I like this graphic because if we agree 5% is a good rate of return for the bank to make on giving me this loan, they're also going to charge me for what they think inflation is going to be over the lifetime of the loan, and that's going to be the nominal interest rate that they charge me. Something else that banks have done is they've come up with adjustable rate mortgages. This is the idea that mortgages are 30-year, 15 or 30-year loans, and a lot can happen in that time period. And so banks decided to come up with what's called an adjustable rate mortgage. And the interest rate on your loan is tied to what's going on with inflation. Don't take one of these out. I know I try not to give you advice or tell you anything, but this is what got a lot of people in trouble in the Great Recession. They took out loans at low interest rates, and then as soon as inflation started happening, their interest rate went up and they couldn't afford their loans anymore. And they defaulted and they lost their houses. Not a good idea unless you are very educated on it and you have um, a lot of money sitting around that you could possibly tap into need be. I wouldn't recommend it. So the nominal interest rate is our percentage increase in money that the borrower is going to pay the lender. It's going to include that real interest rate and that inflation premium. So here, 11%. Real interest rate is the percentage increase in purchasing power that the borrower is going to pay the lender. And then there's that inflation premium. Deflation is going to have the opposite effect on everyone. Deflation is going to help people with fixed incomes and creditors and people with savings accounts. It's going to hurt the other side. Typically, though, at the end of the day, we're not just one thing. Many of us are borrowers and lenders. Most of us have savings, um, and we also are borrowers. And most people at the end of the day are going to be simultaneously helped and hurt by inflation. So at the end of the day, if you're trying to figure out where your position is based on inflation, you're going to have to look at both how you're helped and how you're helped and how you're hurt to figure it out. Inflation is pretty arbitrary. It takes from some, it gives to others, doesn't really care. Rich, poor, young, healthy, old, sick, everybody's affected by inflation. So here's your snapshot: winners and losers of unanticipated inflation. Make sure you know these. Last thing we got to talk about is the output effect of inflation. So inflation not only redistributes total income, but it also affects our real output and real income. So we're talking GDP. So um, abrupt and unexpected rises in resource price is going to cause uh, this cost push inflation. It's going to cause this decrease in supply, which is going to push up prices, and that's going to give us our worst case economic scenario of stagflation. We're going to have falling output, meaning higher unemployment and higher prices. As price rises, quantity of goods and services demanded is going to fall, causing output to fall if we're not buying as much stuff. There aren't as many jobs. We saw this in the 70s during the OPEC withholding oil from the United States, and then another supply shock. So cost push inflation is going to be what causes stagflation, um, and it's going to decrease our output and increase that inflation. Economists do not fully agree on the effects of mild demand pull inflation, right? This increase in demand uh, tends to increase prices, but it's more output, which actually means there's more jobs and more people making money. So they don't typically deal with it. Um, People that argue against even having mild inflation, um, they say it takes away time and effort that we could um, put towards activities. Uh, we've got to figure out how to deal with it. So businesses have to change prices, and that takes time and money. They got to pay somebody to do it, to input it into their computers so that it rings up correctly. Got to change the tags on the prices. And so people say even mild inflation is inefficient. It wastes resources that we could be using to do other things. Without that inflation, we could be using those resources differently. So even mild inflation, some economists say, is harmful to growth. On the other hand, there are economists that say full employment and economic growth depend on strong levels of spending. All that excess spending creates high profits, strong demand. Those things are going to make us better off. And if the inflation is a byproduct of strong spending, our economy is going to be better off and we're going to grow. And they also say inflation makes it easier to adjust real wages when demand falls. They can hold nominal wages steady